My mother says that when I was little, it used to take at least an hour for me to toddle around the block because I had to stop and look at every leaf and bug and flower. The awe of the amazing living things that we share this planet with drove me to a career in science, at least academically. I did research, I taught, but the storytelling in my family background was a part of what I did as a teacher and as a writer all along. And I want to tell you on this special Sunday morning, I want to tell you a story that I think is the most awesome of all. It's one of the oldest stories I know, and you might ask, how old? Well, at least 5 billion years old. Now, if you stretch your arms from side to side, here's the start, and then about 1 billion, 2 billion, 3 billion, 4 billion, 5 billion for now. That's the time span of our planet Earth. Earth started out in a mess. You see, there had been a red giant star that was one of the original ones in the universe, and after it got tired of fusing its hydrogen into helium and helium into carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and sulfur, and all those things, it got up to about iron, and each successive fusion was not given enough energy to keep that star puffed out to its red giant size, and it imploded and it exploded. It went supernova, and the heat of that supernova fused things that a mere star couldn't do: silver, gold, platinum, all the way up to lead and uranium, all that heavy stuff. But my golly, it made a mess. About 5 billion years ago in this neighborhood, there were rocks and space junk of all kinds just spinning around. A few million years went by, and the helium had kind of swirled into the center and coalesced into a new star, our friendly neighborhood star, Sol. And some of the space junk colliding into each other and making bunches, and it made planets. And number 3 is the one we're familiar with. That's the one we call Earth. But by that point, early on in the time frame there, Earth was a red hot smoking mess. It was red hot because all the energy of those things crashing together made a molten ball. If you had had a time machine, you wouldn't want to visit. Earth looked like hell, literally. Its atmosphere of nitrogen, carbon dioxide, sulfur, bleh, you couldn't breathe that. But after a while, Earth cooled a little, and droplets of moisture from its atmosphere condensed and fell and turned into steam, of course, and more fell and gradually cooled off, cooled off, cooled off until Earth was covered with an ocean, about here in Earth's time span. Now, that ocean was not pure water. It had dissolved rocks and salts and minerals and carbon and nitrogen compounds that had cooked up in that atmosphere. Ugh, it was kind of a mess, but you know, it didn't take long before little droplets bounded by lipid membranes, they collected some of those chemicals, and they found ways to break down molecules and get energy out of them. And they grew and divided and grew and divided, and they filled the ocean with the first life. Now, given the size of the ocean and the amount of stuff in it, I'm sure there were many, many kinds of life at that time. Of course, if we had a time machine, we would have had to bring microscopes because they were all single cells, microscopic. so many different kinds. But we only know one kind because I guess that was the most successful, and the others either died off or got eaten up because these single-celled things, they learned how to eat each other and grow and divide and grow and divide and change. And by about here, some of them developed a purple pigment that could absorb energy from the sun and use that energy to grow and divide and grow. If we had gone in our time machine, the oceans might have been purple with those early photosynthetic bacteria, those archaeons. And then there were different pigments right about here that were green. Now, the purple wasn't using much of the sun's energy. The green could use blue, and red could use more. They were so successful, they grew and divided and grew and divided, and they ate up most of the purples. And they also found out that they could use, instead of using sulfur like the purples did, they could use water to accept their used up electrons, and that produced, oh dear, that produced oxygen. Now, you know, oxygen, that's powerful stuff. Oxygen can react with just about anything. It reacted with the dissolved iron in the oceans, precipitated iron oxide. The oceans were red with rust. And more and more and more and more, these critters grew, turning the oceans green in places, producing so much oxygen. Those early guys that had grown up without oxygen, they were poisoned. Most of them died. They went extinct. They have a few survivors. You have to look in the mud of swamps or the guts or ruins of organisms where they're safe from oxygen, and they still live there producing their methane. They love beans, be careful. Anyway, these oxygen producing organisms made so much oxygen it went out into the atmosphere, and high up the lightning turned some of it into ozone, and the ozone did an important thing. It shielded the surface of the ocean from the hard ultraviolet that had kept most photosynthetic organisms down low where they were safe. That hard ultraviolet, it can blast your DNA and RNA and give you a really bad sunburn. But now with the ozone layer, they were able to come to the surface, and they produce so much oxygen right here, the middle of the time span. Right here was what they call the oxygen crisis, when so many of those other organisms went extinct. But the survivors, they thrived. They lived, they gathered more, they learned how to use that toxic oxygen to get even more energy out of their food, and they grew and divided and grew, and they found out they didn't have to separate. They could make clumps of cells, they could make tissues, they could make organs, they could make multicellular organisms. We're getting down in the time frame of life. Multicellular organisms that got bigger and bigger and more by you get down to about 500 million years ago, 500 million. It's called the Cambrian explosion, because these creatures, they were eating each other, so those had to have defensive shells. They were attacking one another. They had to have fangs. They had spines. I declare, it looked as though whoever designed them was on something. Anyway, in the Cambrian explosion, we have a fossil record of things mostly in the ocean, though there were some plants on land, and they were just mosses and ferns and things coming along, but things began to live on land as well as in the ocean. So now we're 500 million years ago, 500 million in the span of life. And we get down to right about here. And there was an outburst of volcanic activity, covered the northern continents with lava, killed off 96% of the creatures that were living then. They were killed off in the dark from the dust that filled the air, the hydrogen sulfide that turned into sulfuric acid and rained down. It was not a good time to pay a visit in our time machine to Earth. Although we could breathe the atmosphere, give or take a little sulfuric acid, and there were photosynthetic plants on land, that was a really hard time. And that wasn't the end of the volcanic activity. That was 250 million years ago. About 200 million years ago, there was more volcanic activity that wiped out so many things. It left for the survivors an open field for the dinosaurs. Now, if you've been around any preschoolers, you know the names of so many of those dinosaurs, our favorites from about 200 million years ago. And they thrived and they lived, and seed-bearing plants came along, and flowering plants and insects came along. And then 66 million years ago, don't look up, here came this gigantic, humongous asteroid that plowed into the Earth near where the Yucatan Peninsula is now. And again, the skies filled with dust and cloud, and about 75% of the land and marine organisms went extinct then, including the dinosaurs. But their descendants gave us the birds, the reptiles, their little furry creatures that were living in the shadow of the dinosaurs developed into mammals, and from there on, more and more things that we would recognize. Once things settled down, if we came in our time machine, we could breathe the atmosphere, didn't need a microscope to see what was going on. And then about 200,000 years ago, that's halfway through the fingernail of your longest finger. On the plains of Africa came a two-legged primate down out of the trees and began doing creative things with sticks and rocks. And this critter was able to spread out from Africa into Europe and Asia and beyond. This invasive species, our own species, lived for thousands of years with the energy the sun gave the plants, which animals could eat and people could eat, that drove the wind and drove the water wheels. We lived with just that much energy. About 10,000 years ago, when the interglacial period came along, because the old guys, they had to live in caves with the glaciers and the drop in sea levels. But when things stabilized, humans were able to develop agriculture and cities, laws and bureaucracies, things we would surely recognize. Coming on down to nowadays. If you look on the scale of Earth and life on Earth, the things that are so familiar to us now, rocket science and computers, vaccines and genetic engineering, the internet and Twitter and all of that, actually in the scale of life, if you had a mail file, that would remove our current civilization, which is living on the energy that those marine organisms and land plants built up over millennia, eating the sun, taking in the CO2, which we're letting back out again. Earth has survived 5 major extinctions so far. We're in gear to produce another one in the Anthropocene, changing the climate so that these awesome, amazing, uncountable million of species of plants and animals and microbes with which we share the earth, how many of them will die off? And what about ourselves? It's not a question of save the planet, it'll keep going. Looking at past history, even if the nail file takes us completely off, something will survive, but it may not be us. And that might be a shame because I think humans have done some awesome things too. Our granddaughter asked us, okay, what are humans really good for? I told her, look at a leaf, look at a sunset. I think our job is to look at things and appreciate how awesome they are. Let's see if we can hang around and keep it. Thank you.